Why are Acts 1 and Act 3 so important to a story?
All of the acts, of course, are important, right? But the structurally speaking, Act 1 and Act 3 are super important because we're setting up the right setup in Act 1, and then Act 3 is our resolution. And a bunch of critical things are happening here. That we're seeing a character in the first act have a want that they're going to achieve, and then they're either going to keep that want in the end, and then they have what I call a tragic story, probably. They're actually going to have a sad ending because in life, it's not what you want, it's what you need. And the character, if they've held on to this want, they're not really addressing the thing that they needed to get. And so we're going to find out that tragic aspect in the third act. And so structurally, that's where the important pieces are. Act 2, which is traditionally called, actually Aristotle called it the complication, right? Which is, reminiscent of a lot of plot synopses you've seen. This happens and then complications ensue, right? And so it's the product of the things we set up in Act 1. So we set up all this stuff, and so now it's playing out in Act 2. So it's not that Act 2 isn't important, but it's set up in Act 1. We're setting up who the character is, who needs to be tested by the particular journey. The journey is the middle part. Interestingly, what people think about as being the guts of a story is the second act, like an audience, like they, that a movie like Sideways is about two friends going to wine country and complications ensue, right? That's what people think of as a movie being. It's whatever we set up at the end of Act 1 is then testing that character through Act 2. But that's not really what the story is about. What the story's really about is about a man who's lost his confidence, who's been unable to act in daring ways, learning to discover that, right? And so that's set up by seeing a guy in the beginning who is ineffective and is a liar a lot of the times and wants people to believe he's got a book coming out when, at the same time he's really unsure that anything's going to happen with it. And then in the third act of him finally coming into his own after hitting a rock bottom and daring to open that expensive bottle of wine that he had been holding on forever, in the third act. So all the acts are important, but structurally speaking, the things that we're setting up exist in Act 1 and Act 3. And if we set them up correctly with the right glue, it's going to do all the heavy lifting of supporting Act 2, even though Act 2 is twice as long and does not contain any structural elements. The way I like to think about Act 2 is that Act 1, at the very end of it, we've had what I call the point of no return, this big event that's going to push the story in a different direction that the character doesn't expect, and that's going to challenge them throughout Act 2. And so as long as we set up the right one, and there's a bunch of criteria for getting a good point of no return, but set up so that it's causing a major problem for the protagonist that they're going to have to deal with in Act 2. We don't need any other structure. So Act 2 is really about having this point of no return that comes with this big catch, which is a problem they're going to have to deal with throughout Act 2. And then the only other element is that I tell writers, you want to keep throwing obstacles at the character. Just keep throwing obstacles. You got to make sure they don't enjoy themselves, even for a second, right? That just constantly throw problem after problem. But that's not the same thing as those like critical structural elements that were in Act 1 and Act 3. So Act 1 and Act 3 have the critical structural elements, and Act 2 is more about obstacle after obstacle, once you presented them with what the story's going to be about, keeping them from being happy.
Right, and if I remember correctly, in Sideways, does Miles and Thomas Hayden Church character, they go to Miles's mom's house? Is that still in Act One? I'm not quite sure. And you really see, I'm not sure if there's mention of money being loaned, when are you paying it back? And I think he takes money, and you kind of really see like how desperate this character is.
Yeah. Right? It's the setup. We see he's a loser, right? We see, I mean, everything in Act One is backing that up. You know, from the moment where, and he's also a liar too, that like, you know, he tells his friend, you know, he overslept because he was hungover, and his friend is like, you know, where are you? Where are you? And he's like, yeah, I'll be there in a moment. And then cut to, he's sitting on the toilet reading a book. Like, he's just full of it. And then he complains, oh, it was traffic. That's why I'm late. You know, so he's full of lies. He's full of ways he's trying to cover his insecurities about who he is. And I've got a friend who's, you know, a famous-ish person, and I'm the schlubby loser friend, and I'm trying to deal with that. And yeah, we see him steal money from his mother and all those things, right? That's the setup of identifying who the character is, who they are, before this big event's going to happen that's going to change them and change his life.
Lastly, you've said about how you want the character to feel very uncomfortable about themselves. Throughout the entire trip, he's reminded of things, whether it's overtly or covertly, whether it's his own insecurity or someone tells him, yeah, you know, they make an off-cuff remark about looks or whatever it is. So
Yeah.
he's uncomfortable the entire time.
Yeah. You know, his inability to make a move on Maya, the love interest, the first time, even though it's an obvious time, right? All these things. And then also seeing it illustrated in his friend's casualness with this affair he picks up, and the drama that comes with it that's so natural, and it doesn't even bother him almost, even though he gets, you know, beat up by it. And actually, and Miles gets drawn into it too.
Jill, did I hear you correctly that you don't actually enjoy doing rewrites, or that it's sort of a pet peeve?
Does anybody enjoy doing rewrites? I mean, I think some people do, but it's the, and I certainly will, I will do as many drafts as I have to. I mean, I've been involved with a project recently as a co-writer, and, you know, we're up to the 20th draft or so. I mean, rewrites are part of it, right? You know, writing is rewriting, but it's not my favorite part of it. It's a part that I'm going to procrastinate probably because I know it means throwing out things, right? Killing some of your darlings. It may mean doubting the underlying structure. It's just not a particularly pleasant process. So I like to get it as much of the story captured in the first draft. Is the first draft going to be perfect? No, they're never perfect. They're not meant to be perfect. You're going to have to do rewrites. But I don't want to do 16 rewrites. I want to help someone find as complete a structure as possible, and that they feel solid about, so they feel that they've understood their story, and now they can feel that they're pretty confident about the draft, even though, sure, if it's the first draft, of course it's going to need a rewrite. But it's not particularly my favorite part of the process, right? I think most writers, the first draft is the fun part. It's the other part. It's like, oh, I got to do another rewrite. So just trying to minimize that, and particularly since the part that I think I'm really trying to minimize is that a lot of writers come to me, and once I talk with them in a consultation, they agree with my points that I make, but the points may mean they have to throw out 2 acts, I would hate to get that advice. If someone told me you're going to have to throw out your first 2 acts, I would be like, I don't know that I'm going to continue with this project. Now, the writers I work with tend to be fine with it. They're like, well, that's my process. I write drafts. I'm used to it. It doesn't bother me. And I was like, okay, if it doesn't bother you. But they agree. Yep, you're right. I should have started the story later. And so I'll just throw that out, and I'll start from there. But I always find it painful to even give that as advice, because I certainly wouldn't want to be told you got to throw out your first 2 acts.